So now let's take a little bit of time to talk about the file owner and the first responder. This is another somewhat confusing concept, but remember that we're working in an MVC model here when we're developing our interface, and so we don't really know what the underlying class is that's going to be bound to this UI. And so this is kind of where these concepts originate of the file owner and first responder. So first let's look at this file owner. So this file owner is basically going to be the class that or file that has instantiated this view or that's binding to this view. So if we were to look what this file owner is, if we inspect it, we can see that the class is of type main view controller. And that's just because we already have linked this up to say that this is going to be the class that implements the binding points for our user interface. And we could actually make this any class, and that would be what we're going to use for the underlying binding or the controller for this view. So really what this is a way of specifying what your controller is going to be. And this is important because, as you remember, when we'd hooked up our user interface elements, that we use this file owner to basically hook up its outlets to the things in our view. So that's kind of the way file owner works, and the idea here with this MVC architecture is that you could swap that out. You could set up a different file owner. If I had another class that had those same kind of binding points, I could set up those outlets for this view to bind to a different class, and I could provide either a different controller, or I could even take a controller and provide a different view on top of it. The first responder is a similar concept. It basically is a way for event chaining to happen in iOS. So the first responder is also not necessarily typed here. It's going to have a type, but the first responder is basically going to be what is going to handle the first event that occurs. So for example, when you touch a button on your UI, the first responder for that button is going to be the first thing that interprets that UI touch, and then there's an event chain where that first responder could then pass that event to the next responder and next so far down the chain. And so for example, if we have this button that's sitting on top of this view here that we have in the background, if this button declined to react to a touch event, it could then pass that on to the view behind it. And that's all that this first responder really represents here in this user interface. And this concept is probably still a little bit abstract, and that's because it doesn't really have a lot of application existing here in this interface builder. The reason why I say that is because the first responder is determined by the view that's active, and so it's going to determine, usually the first responder is going to be where the touch took place. So for example, when we touch a button, usually in this case the view is going to make the first responder be that button. One really good example, a concrete example of this, is in the instance where we had this text field, and if you remember when we clicked on the text field or touched on the text field, it brought up a keyboard. And that's because the first responder for the text field, or the first responder in that case in the touch in the text field, was the text field, and the text field's default behavior when it's a first responder is to bring up the keyboard.